Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I am bringing you essentially a monthly wrap-up, but with a twist. I came up with an idea at the beginning of February to dictate my to-read pile for the month, just as a way to switch things up a little bit, because I always have a pile of books that I haven't read yet, but I tend to just pick through them as my fancy takes me. I don't often set myself specific books to read at specific times, and I thought it would be interesting to give myself a set reading list for a month. So I decided that I would let StoryGraph pick what I read this month. StoryGraph is what I use instead of Goodreads. Essentially, it's another website for tracking your reading, but it also has a whole load of other features that Goodreads does not have. It's also an independent, black, female-owned business, so I am very happy to support it in that way. And at the bottom of the homepage, it gives you a selection of books from your to-read pile, just as a little at-a-glance thing, but it means that you are given 4 random books from your to-read pile to look at. And I thought, what if I just read those 4 books? What if I made those 4 books my definites for this month? And so I did that. I sat down and I refreshed the homepage a couple of times and then took a look at what I had been given. I was given these 4 books. This isn't the order they came up on the website, this is the order in which I read them. So I thought I would just go through them one by one and tell you what my thoughts were about them. So the first book that I read this month was Let's Talk About Love by Claire Can, and I did a whole video on this because my thoughts were varied and on the whole not positive, but equally it was a very, very difficult thing to gauge. Essentially my criticisms were that it was very, very strangely written and it made almost no sense to read, but the benefits were that it gave incredible representation to a number of marginalised identities and to a lot of aspects of teenage and young adult life that often don't get given particularly good press in books. And so on balance I thought it probably did a lot of good, but that it just wasn't an enjoyable reading experience and I found it difficult to go through. However, on balance, because I know it has done a lot for minority communities, I can't say that this is a bad book. I was looking through reviews of it on StoryGraph and there were loads and loads of 5-star reviews from people saying, I cried because I have never seen myself represented like that. And I thought about my reaction to Loveless and how it was exactly the same. I gave it 5 stars because I had never felt so seen, and I thought, I can't say that this is a bad book, I can't deny people the experience of that. So that's the TLDR of that full video. If it represents you, if you enjoy it, if it works for you, all power to you. I just found that as a book, ignoring the representation and things, it was utterly bizarre. The second book that I was given by StoryGraph to read is one that has been sat on my to-read pile for about 6 years, I think, meaning that I picked this up when I was probably about 12 or 13, and I have never read it, but I have also never got rid of it. I couldn't tell you why. That book is The Letter for the King by Tonke Dracht. This book was written in the 1960s, and when I had a look at Tonke Dracht and about her, she was imprisoned in a Japanese concentration camp during World War II and wrote her first story while she was imprisoned there because there were no books to read. So she just wrote her own stories, and I was like, this woman is incredible, I have to give this book a go, and because StoryGraph made me, so I was very, very pleased to finally get a shot at reading it. The Letter for the King is a pretty bog-standard childhood fantasy novel. It is the story of Tiuri, who is a knight in training in the land of King Dagonaut, and he is in his vigil, the final stage of his ascension to knighthood, when there is a knock at the door that he is not meant to answer, but he goes anyway and finds a man telling him that there is a letter that needs to be delivered to the other king in the next kingdom along, King Unawen. and that this letter is of vital importance and is up to Tiuri to take this letter to a knight who is waiting at an inn on the edge of the land, and that the kingdom is in peril if he doesn't. And so Tiuri abandons his vigil. He knows he won't get his knighthood, but he goes to deliver the letter. Only when he gets there, he finds that the knight can no longer take the letter, and so it is up to him, Tiuri, to do it. And so this follows his travels through at least 2 or 3 different kingdoms in this fantastical land as he tries to deliver the letter for the king. And this book was just joyous, I found. It is such a bog-standard fantasy in that it is a knight in a sort of feudal medieval kingdom travelling through these lands, meeting monks and other knights, and a goat herd boy at one point who he befriends. He gets into all kinds of scrapes in his endeavours to deliver this letter, and it is, I don't want to say formulaic, but you know exactly how it's going to pan out, and it is beautifully predictable. I thought it was just incredibly endearing as a story. It felt so familiar already because it followed so many of the classical roots of these kinds of adventure stories, and I really enjoyed reading it. It was a little hard at times to read just because it is 500 pages long of the same kind of thing of Tiuri meets someone, they are either good or bad, and it either helps or hinders his journey, and he deals with the consequences of that and then continues his travels. But I have to say, it was good fun to read. I read this over 5 days and read 100 pages a day because I thought that would be the easiest way to do it, and really honestly it was so nice to just sit down, read 100 pages and then get on with my day. It was a really, really nice book in that way, and I think it's the perfect kind of story for reading to younger siblings or to younger children because it is just really, really sweet, and I'm glad that I have read it. Also, I found out while I was looking up the book to find out a little bit more about it and the author, it turns out that last year Netflix put out a series based on it called The Letter for the King, and I was just like, how is this not a bigger thing? Like, this story is a very, very well-known one, and it is a classic of the genre with the tropes that it carries, with the themes it carries. I was amazed that this wasn't a bigger deal, or that it wasn't just talked about that Netflix had made a series based on it, so I think I will watch that because I am interested to see how they adapt this story because it is so whimsically, not childish, but that it has that very much familiarity of childhood stories to it. And I like the story. It's nice, Tiuri's a sweet character, and I would happily sit through his adventures another time. I doubt that I would reread this just because it is such a big book for such a simplistic, basic plot, but it was really, really nice to have read, and I would recommend it if you're looking for something really, really easygoing, really palatable. If you just want some effectively mindless reading to do, I think it is a really, really sweet book, and that it is perfect for people like me who aren't big on sort of high concept fantasy to just read something kind of sweet and whimsical and childish. The next book that StoryGraph chose for me was Girl Made of Stars by Ashley Herring Blake. I knew this book was going to be a lot, and I also was pretty sure that it was going to be good. It was one of those books that I just had a feeling about, and oh my god, this book was mind-blowing. It was so heartfelt and intensive and beautiful, but not in like a good way, if you know what I mean. Girl Made of Stars is about a girl named Mara who finds out one day that one of her best friends, called Hannah, was supposedly raped by her twin brother Owen. Mara is incredibly close with Owen, they always have been throughout her life, and Hannah was his girlfriend as well, so she was shocked and appalled to hear Hannah accuse him of this. And so this book is about the loyalty to her family and to her friends and to the truth, and about her working out exactly what the balance of those things are as she negotiates her relationship with Owen, as she attempts to stay friends with Hannah in the light of this, and as she works out her complicated feelings towards her ex-girlfriend Charlie, who she broke up with because she was struggling to be intimate with. And throughout this, Mara has a lot of realisations about her own bodily autonomy and about a trauma that she went through in the near past and how severely it has affected her as well. This book was just... it was stunning in how raw it was. You know, it doesn't shy away from how ugly it is. You know, they talk about, quite graphically, they talk about the event of Owen having raped Hannah. Hannah doesn't shy away from the details. It's very feminist. Mara is part of the feminist publication at her school and so knows that this will be something brought up in the club as they talk about what goes into their next issue. And it was difficult to read in parts because, as I say, it is graphic and honest and raw, but I found it almost cleansing to that effect because it is realistic in all of its blunt, horrific glory, and I couldn't stop reading it. I needed to know that Mara and Hannah and Charlie would all be okay, and that I was desperate for something to happen to bring justice to what Owen did. I won't spoil about whether or not that happens, but I thought it was realistic and heartrending, and I think it is one of those books that is difficult to recommend to people, especially people who have been through something like what Hannah or Mara went through, but that for people who are allies and supporters of people who have been through rape and sexual assault, it is a very, very necessary read to be able to understand what they have gone through. And it's terrifying to read just as a woman, I find. You know, the statistics are that like 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and it is only a matter of time, therefore, for most people about when that will happen. So it was awful to read in that knowledge, but equally I was so impressed by how well handled the topic was and how all-consuming it was to Mara as she tries to work out what this means for her as a sister, as a friend, as an ex-girlfriend to Charlie. And I really enjoyed her character and the characters of Charlie and Hannah and of Owen in many ways, and Owen's best friend Alex as well. There is a lot of really, really interesting discussion from sort of the boys aspect of it, because Mara talks to Alex, who is Owen's best friend, about what he thinks. Not only does he think that Owen did it, but what does that make him think about Owen? And I thought it was really, really good in the way that it... good doesn't feel like a strong enough word to talk about the impact this book can have, but I just thought it handled everything with such care and attention without shying away from the details, but without making it gratuitous. And I thought it was an incredible book to that end, and it's on my shelves now. I am keeping a hold of this. It is an incredible story. I don't know when I'll read it again just because, oh boy, it was hard to read, but I cannot overstate how valuable this book is as a discussion around bodily autonomy and about, you know, to an extent things like, can you separate the art from the artist and things like that? Can Mara separate Owen from the horrible act he has committed? Highly recommend. Equally, if this is the kind of thing that you would struggle with in terms of the content, you know, StoryGraph has content warnings on the website so you can check out how graphic specific aspects of the story are and if you can stomach it. But if you will be okay with it, I think it is a very necessary read. And then the final book that StoryGraph picked for me to read this month is Vicious by Ve Schwab. This was one that I found, again, like with If We Were Villains and The Secret History, I found it through Dark Academia pages on Instagram, and people were suggesting it was a good Dark Academia sci-fi fantasy book, and that it contained a lot of tropes that I like, including found family and things like that, so I bought it a little while back. I was also interested because I know on BookTube and Bookstagram in particular, Ve Schwab is an author who gets mentioned a lot, and so I was interested to read one of her books and see how I feel about it. So Vicious is about Victor and Eli, who were 2 college roommates who started researching extraordinaries for their thesis. Extraordinaries are sort of urban legend of people who gain superpowers after they experience a traumatic near-death experience. And so Victor and Eli, in their research of them, decide that they want to see if you can create an EO. And so they embark on some horrific experimentation on themselves. It's very Jekyll and Hyde-esque in that way, to work out exactly what it takes to create an EO. And in that exploration, they end up gaining superpowers themselves. However, as they are doing this, Victor accidentally kills someone, and Eli has a crisis of conscience, so he calls the police, and Victor is put in jail for 10 years for the accidental murder of one of his classmates. But Victor escapes from prison with the help of one of his friends 10 years later. He is at the very, very end of his sentence, and he sets out to kill Eli, because in the past 10 years, Eli has been killing EOs. He has decided they are a crime against nature, and he thinks they shouldn't exist. But on the way, Victor ends up picking up a young girl named Sydney, who it turns out also has some superpowers, and Eli has found Sydney's sister, Serena, who also has powers. And so this book follows in a lot of flashbacks to the past, the journey that Victor and Eli went on to becoming EOs themselves, and then follows the present day events as Victor tracks down Eli and they prepare to show down against each other. I found this book incredibly addictive to read. It is messed up, like really messed up. The things Victor and Eli do to themselves and each other to try and essentially nearly kill each other so that they can gain these powers are awful, and I felt ill reading some parts of this because it's graphic as all hell. But it was so interesting. It was so interesting to read about EOs as a concept, about Victor and Eli themselves and their thoughts about what it means to be EOs and to live in a world where EOs exist. About Sydney and her sister. They have such a complex relationship, which I didn't necessarily understand at all times, but was fascinated by regardless. About Victor's pal Mitch, who helps him escape prison and so who is helping him out. They essentially become, this is where the found family element is. Victor and Mitch, they're kind of like an old married couple, and the way they just adopt Sydney was, you know, for two guys who kill people, I was quite enamoured with how sweet they were towards her. And Eli, of course, who is messed up to the extreme, who has essentially become a religious fanatic and is attempting to eradicate a race of people that he deems unnatural. I thought that was a really, really interesting reflection on sort of internalised hatred towards aspects of yourself, and I won't say that this was the most satisfying book to read. It felt like it spent rather too long building up the flashbacks so that you could understand what was going on in the present day, so that when you finally got to just the present day and you were out of flashbacks, it was kind of like, okay, I get why we're here, but it kind of feels a bit lame that it's now just them sort of hiding out in hotel buildings trying to work out where they are so they can go and try and kill each other. It didn't feel like the build-up led to a satisfying enough event for me. I do know that there is a sequel to this book, and I had a look at what the sequel was about. I don't think I'll read it. I'm happy enough with the ending that Vicious gave me. I'm happy to accept that that is the end of the road with the story. I don't know, I may end up reading Vengeful at some point because I liked this book well enough, but I wasn't gagging for more by the end of the story. I wasn't desperate to find out more about them. I'm happy to say that is the end of the road for Victor, Eli and Sydney and go, cool, happy with that ending. Done with it now. I liked it. I don't really have much more complex thoughts. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was a very, very different style of dark academia book. Most dark academia tends to be sort of contemporary or vaguely historical in its context, but this was pure sci-fi, fantasy, magical realism, and it was a really, really nice change for me. I think it's a really, really good bridge of that gap between dark academia and more solid genres. So if you are someone who likes sci-fi and fantasy, I definitely think this would be an interesting one to pick up. For me, it just wasn't quite my thing. I liked it a lot, but it didn't grab me in the same way I know it has done for other people. So yeah, nice. I'll probably reread it again at some point because I feel like there's still more I can get from the story and from these characters that I didn't pick up from a first reading. But I don't think it's worth me buying the sequel yet. Maybe I will in the future. Yeah, it was good. And there we go. Those were the 4 books that StoryGraph picked for me to read in the month of February. I have to say, I thought this was an excellent way to get through my to-read pile. I definitely wouldn't have picked these 4 books in a row from each other had I just been going through my list of books to read and working out what I wanted to read next, but it did mean that I finally read The Letter for the King, which has been waiting for me to read for 6 years. It meant I picked up a couple of books that I had been sort of waiting to be ready for, like Girl Made of Stars. I didn't know if this was the kind of book that I was at the right point to be reading, but I would have been waiting for a long time to be in the perfect mood to read a story about rape culture, you know? I thought it was a really, really good way to just take a dent out of my to-read pile and to get cracking on some books that I probably would have waited a fair while to read otherwise. So I would highly recommend using that little homepage function of StoryGraph if you're looking for a new way to crack down on your to-read pile. And generally, I think the StoryGraph's great. So, yeah. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it was interesting to hear me talk about these 4 books. They're a motley group. They don't all fit in very well. They're rather like the gang in Vicious in that way. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Comment down below, do you use StoryGraph? Because I feel like it's becoming bigger, but a lot of people are still quite wedded to Goodreads, so this is my plea to you, that if you are currently using Goodreads, check out StoryGraph. It offers so much more than Goodreads, and it's not owned by Jeff Bezos. We love not supporting billionaires. Subscribe to my channel if you want to see me talk about more bookish content, and I will see you next time. It's warm. As much as I am enjoying Britain having finally acknowledged that it's spring, I am warm, and I don't appreciate being warm. It's February! I should still be wearing jumpers. What is this? Yes, I know, I read a lot of dark academia books about people killing their classmates. I will not elaborate on the subject.